The first warning wasn't sight. It was sound, a high-pitched whine cutting through the fog, sharp and unnatural. Then came the impact, a metallic roar as a German Panther exploded somewhere beyond the ridge. September 19th, 1944. Eastern France. Oberleutnant Klaus Richter slammed the hatch shut and gripped the cold rim of his cupola. The battlefield outside was a grey labyrinth of hedgerows and smoke. Visibility, 30 meters at best. Somewhere in that mist, something was moving fast. "Report," he barked into the intercom. "Nothing on optics, sir," his gunner answered. "No armor silhouettes, just movement." Richter frowned. Tanks don't move like that. For 2 years he'd fought on the Eastern Front. He had watched T-34 seconds burn by the dozens, survived the artillery inferno of Kursk, and earned his Iron Cross by commanding calm under Soviet fire. He knew the rhythm of armored war, the predictable tempo of advance, aim, and counterfire. But what was happening now did not belong to that rhythm. 2 days earlier, a patrol near Nancy had returned shaken, muttering about something new, an American machine so fast it seemed unreal. 17 minutes of combat, 8 Panthers destroyed. Survivors described vehicles that appeared out of nowhere, fired once, and vanished before return fire could even begin. Richter had called it hysteria. Now, as static crackled through his radio and another explosion tore through the fog, he began to wonder if the hysteria had been truth trying to warn him. He raised his binoculars. Nothing but shifting grey. Then a flicker of motion. A flash of steel low to the ground, slicing across a field at impossible speed. He blinked, and it was gone. "Contact west," his driver shouted. "Traverse." Quickly. 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 The turret groaned, slow and heavy. The Panther's 45 tons turned like a continent trying to move. A muzzle flash ripped the fog open. A shell screamed overhead and struck the tree line behind them. Richter's heart slammed against his ribs. "Identify the target. Unknown. It's fast." Another flash. Another impact. A Panther to their left burst into flame. In Richter's mind, the map of the battlefield was fracturing. Their carefully planned defensive arcs meant nothing against an enemy that refused to stay still. He shouted for fire correction, range-finding anything, but there was nothing to aim at. Only whispers of motion and the mechanical echo of something that came and went like a ghost. It lasted less than 3 minutes. 3 minutes of confusion, smoke, and panic. Then silence. Whatever had struck them had vanished, leaving only the stench of fuel and burning oil. That night, in his field notebook, Richter wrote a single observation. They were not tanks, they were phantoms machines faster than reason. He didn't know it yet, but what had destroyed his formation was no phantom at all. It was a machine born from Detroit steel and American pragmatism, built not for endurance, but for velocity. The M18 Hellcat, a weapon so fast it rewrote the physics of armoured warfare. And as the fog settled over the French countryside, the myth of German invincibility began to die silently, at 55 miles per hour. To the German General Staff, warfare was an equation of control. Every component, fuel, range, gun, elevation, armor thickness, was calculated, optimized, perfected. Since 1939, the Wehrmacht had built its victories on precision, the mechanical and moral alignment of men and machines. From Poland to France, from Kiev to Kharkov, the logic of blitzkrieg was simple. Speed through discipline, destruction through order. For the engineers in Kassel and Nuremberg, for the generals in Berlin, and for every tank commander like Klaus Richter, the Panther represented this philosophy made flesh-steel, shaped by mathematics and faith. It was the child of industrial science, the successor to the brutal Panzer IV, and the answer to the Soviet T-34. Weighing 45 tons, its sloped armor could deflect most Allied shells. Its 75mm KUK 42 liters, 70 gun, was a masterpiece of ballistic engineering, able to penetrate 130 millimeters of armor at a kilometer's range. It was not just a weapon, It was the embodiment of rational power. Every crewman inside it was part of a machine designed to dominate physics itself. The German soldier trusted the idea that quality defeated quantity, that perfection of design outweighed industrial mass. Their tanks weren't cheap, they were crafted. To Richter, to his superiors, to Hitler himself, industrial might meant precision, not abundance. Germany had built a civilization on the notion that control, mechanical, mental, moral, was destiny. In contrast, the American system was chaos disguised as efficiency. At least, that was how the Germans saw it. The United States produced tanks like they produced refrigerators, fast, repetitive, lacking elegance. The American M4 Sherman, with its welded hull and flat armor, was a joke in German barracks. Wehrmacht officers mocked it as the Ronson-Leiter, a tank that burned when hit. In the German mind, the industrial flood of American machines was a sign of barbarism, not mastery. The Reich believed that a civilization measured by quality, not volume, was superior. To them, factories that could turn out 100,000 vehicles a year were impressive but also vulgar. Real engineering meant one Panther, perfectly built, not 10 Shermans rolling off an assembly line like toys. By 1944, this logic was collapsing, but the men on the ground didn't see it yet. Their faith remained in the numbers and the doctrine that had carried them across Europe. The Panzer divisions were still the sharp edge of German identity, iron extensions of a culture that worshipped form, discipline, and hierarchy. Even when resources dwindled, even as the fuel convoys dried up, the illusion persisted. If the machines were perfect enough, they could overcome everything else. But industrial civilization doesn't reward perfection. It rewards adaptability. And somewhere deep inside the corridors of American command in 1941, another kind of logic was taking shape. While German engineers obsessed over armor thickness and gear ratios, Major General Andrew Bruce studied the mathematics of speed. He saw what most didn't: that armor was a paradox. The thicker it got, the slower it moved. The slower it moved, the easier it was to destroy. In Bruce's view, survival didn't come from resisting hits, it came from never being hit at all. At Camp Hood, Texas, Bruce rewrote the book on armored warfare. He didn't want heavy tanks lumbering across battlefields. He wanted tank destroyers, machines that would strike, kill, and disappear before the enemy could respond. Seek, strike, and destroy became not a slogan, but a system. This was the beginning of a cultural divergence. Germany's war machine believed in immovable perfection. America's believed in adaptable motion. That divergence echoed through their industries. Where Germany engineered masterpieces one by one, America industrialized improvisation. The Buick Motor Division, a civilian automobile company, was tasked to build a weapon of war, something that broke every rule of conventional tank design. The engineers didn't start with armor requirements or ballistic math. They started with a single question: how fast can we make it go? The result was the M18 Hellcat, a 17-ton Phantom with a Continental R975 engine, capable of 55 miles per hour, the fastest tracked armored vehicle of the war. It traded armor for acceleration, mass for mobility, fear for initiative. It was built not to endure battle, but to outpace it. From the German perspective, such a design was madness. A tank with open turrets, paper-thin armor, built by Buick? Richter would have laughed if he hadn't seen it move. The irony was brutal. Germany's engineers had spent years mastering precision. America had mastered the system. One side built perfection. The other built velocity. And in 1944, velocity was the deadlier god. Because while German command viewed the battlefield as a geometry of positions and lines of fire, the Americans had turned it into something fluid, almost industrial in rhythm machines as fast as supply chains, soldiers synchronized like assembly lines. For the first time in modern war, industrial tempo was outpacing battlefield doctrine. In September 1944, as Richter peered through the fog of Lorraine, what he faced was not just another tank. It was an idea, the idea that survival no longer depended on how thick your armor was, but how fast your civilization could think, build, and move. Germany had placed its faith in the armor of men and machines. America placed its faith in the armor of systems. The outcome was already written in the hum of engines coming from the west, and by the time the Panther commanders realized it, the Hellcat had already vanished, leaving behind only the echo of a truth they'd refused to see. Power no longer belonged to the strongest fortress. It belonged to the fastest factory. What the Germans didn't know was that their enemy had stopped thinking about tanks as machines. America thought of them as products. By 1943, while Hitler's engineers were still arguing over armor thickness and sloped geometry, the U.S. Army Ordnance Department had quietly merged with the industrial arteries of Detroit. Ford, Chrysler, and Buick were no longer car companies. They were factories of war logic. In a world where Germany measured quality by precision craftsmanship, the United States measured it by repeatability. Every bolt, every gear, every shell was designed not for uniqueness, but for replacement. If it broke, another one was already on its way. That was the logic the Hellcat came from. A machine not designed by tank generals, but by automotive engineers who had never seen combat. They didn't talk about armor, slope angles, or battlefield survivability. They talked about gear ratios, fuel-to-weight efficiency, and assembly line interchangeability. In the German worldview, that was insanity. In the American one, it was evolution. At the Buick Motor Division, Chief Engineer J. Edward Campbell, a former racing car designer, ignored the conventional wisdom of tank warfare. His team stripped down the chassis of a light tank, tore off the excess steel, and replaced it with air, speed, and precision handling. The engine, a 9-cylinder Continental R975, was originally designed for aircraft. Its roar wasn't the growl of a tank. It was the scream of a radial engine turned predator. The prototype, known as T70, stunned even its creators. In trials at the Ardennes proving grounds, the speedometer needle swept past 50 miles per hour. Test observers thought it was broken. It wasn't. The machine was simply outrunning the limits of what armor had ever meant. To the Germans, tanks were bastions. To the Americans, they were hunters. The result was a machine that seemed to violate logic. 17 tons, open-topped, nearly unarmored, yet armed with a 76mm M18 gun that could tear through a Panther's side armor at 1,000 meters. It was built to kill, not survive. But survival, as Campbell understood, didn't depend on armor, it depended on motion. From a distance, the Hellcat looked fragile, like a stripped-down racing frame. Inside, it was something else entirely, a kinetic organism, where every second was currency. The turret could spin a full 360 degrees in 20 seconds, powered by hydraulics adapted from naval gun mounts. It could accelerate to 30 miles per hour in under 12 seconds. In the time it took a German crew to crank their Panther's turret into firing position, the Hellcat could reposition, fire, and disappear. When the first M18s rolled off the production lines in early 1944, they weren't just new vehicles, they were the embodiment of a new doctrine. Their motto was simple: seek, strike, destroy. Every Hellcat crew was trained like a small, self-contained strike system. No long coordination chains, no bureaucratic command layers. Each platoon 5 vehicles acted like a swarm, moving, firing, and withdrawing independently. The Germans never saw it coming because they couldn't imagine such a system existing. Their doctrine was built on hierarchy: commander, section, division, corps. Every action required orders, verification, and approval. The Hellcat didn't wait for orders. It moved on instinct backed by mathematics. In Texas, crews drilled on open fields under brutal heat, learning to race, pivot, and relocate faster than any enemy could track. They weren't trained to fight in formations. They were trained to fight like hunters in motion: shoot, vanish, reappear. By the time the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion arrived in Europe in June 1944, their movement patterns resembled something new, a synthesis of industry and instinct. And this was the contradiction at the heart of the war. The Germans fought with the logic of the workshop: perfect pieces, perfectly made. The Americans fought with the logic of the assembly line: fast, imperfect, infinitely replaceable. The Germans believed that mastery was control. The Americans proved that mastery was flow. Even their manufacturing sites told the story. At the Flint plant in Michigan, Buick's assembly lines churned day and night. Each Hellcat rolled forward on the same conveyor system that once built family sedans. Welders, most of them women, worked to the rhythm of machinery that didn't care about ideology. The same hands that built convertibles were now welding the future of armored warfare. Every 10 minutes, another Hellcat was born. Every hour, another crew in Europe would owe its survival to a factory worker they'd never meet. By the summer of 1944, more than 2,400 M18s had crossed the Atlantic, each one a symbol of a civilization that didn't just make machines, it made systems that made machines. And while German officers like Klaus Richter still trusted in the precision of their handcrafted Panthers, the Americans had already industrialized agility itself. When the Hellcat finally appeared on the Western Front, it wasn't a surprise attack. It was the inevitable outcome of a civilization that had learned how to mass-produce speed. In that moment, the contrast between the two worlds, one built on ideology, the other on efficiency, became a weapon sharper than any gun. Germany had mastered the tank. America had mastered the system that builds tanks faster than wars can consume them. And in the fog of eastern France, that system had just announced itself with a sound that lasted less than 3 minutes and changed the physics of armored combat forever. The Hellcat was never meant to be beautiful. It was meant to work and to win. At Camp Hood, Texas, the tank destroyer program became an experiment in applied pragmatism. Major General Andrew Bruce, who had predicted that speed would one day replace armor, organized his training center like a factory of thought. Every instructor was a foreman. Every crew, a production unit. They drilled until reaction became reflex, not courage, not inspiration, but industrial instinct. In this new kind of warfare, time replaced protection. The stopwatch was a weapon. The anatomy of speed. The M18 Hellcat weighed just 17 tons, half the mass of a German Panther and almost a third of a Tiger. The trade-off was deliberate. The Germans armored themselves against fear. The Americans engineered themselves against delay. Its Continental R-975 radial engine, derived from aircraft design, produced 400 horsepower. The power-to-weight ratio, 23.5 horsepower per ton, was higher than any armored vehicle of the war. The Hellcat didn't crawl into battle, it sprinted. On roads, it could reach 55 miles per hour. Across open country, it maintained 35. That engine wasn't just propulsion, it was ideology cast in aluminum. To an American engineer, every pound of unnecessary armor was heresy. Weight was the enemy of freedom, and the Hellcat was built for the gospel of motion. The result was paradoxical. The most lightly armored tank destroyer became the most survivable because it was almost impossible to hit. Even its vulnerabilities were turned into weapons. The open turret, which seemed suicidal to European sensibilities, saved 3 tons of steel. But more importantly, it gave crews complete situational awareness. They could hear enemy engines before they appeared. They could reload faster, communicate instantly, and operate like a racing team instead of a fortress crew. And when the wind swept across the turret, it carried the scent of oil, cordite, and exhaust the perfume of industrial America. The 76mm M1A2 gun, firing armor-piercing rounds at 2,800 feet per second, was not the most powerful weapon of the war. But it didn't have to be. It was built for accuracy and repetition. The hydraulic traverse system, adapted from naval turrets, rotated the Hellcat's gun a full 360 degrees in 20 seconds, 4 times faster than a Panther. Where German tankers hand-cranked their turrets like craftsmen, Hellcat gunners turned theirs like operators at an industrial press. Precision had been mechanized. The production line. Back home, the Buick plant in Flint, Michigan, looked nothing like a weapons factory. It smelled of oil, lacquer, and hot steel. But the rhythm was familiar, the same tempo that had once produced family cars. Now, it produced instruments of velocity. Photographs from 1944 show women in overalls guiding turrets onto hulls with chain hoists. Their faces are streaked with soot and fluorescent light. Above them, banners read, "The faster we build, the sooner they come home." The workers didn't need to understand battlefield tactics. They were the tactics. Every assembly station was a front line, every conveyor a supply artery. The Hellcat was not the genius of one man, it was the orchestration of thousands. The Detroit Arsenal, the Flint Buick plant, the Ordnance Department, and the Tank Destroyer Command were not four institutions. They were one machine, a machine that thought, built, shipped, and fought with a unity no other nation could match. Every 19 minutes, another M18 rolled off the line. Every crate of spare parts, ammunition, and replacement engines was pre-labeled, serialized, and logged into a network that stretched from Michigan to Marseille. The Germans called this chaos. It was actually synchronization industrial warfare in its purest form, the human engine. By the time the Hellcat reached Europe, the crews trained at Camp Hood had become something else, soldiers who thought like engineers. Lieutenant Marcus Webb, commander of the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion, described it best in his after-action report from August 12, 1944. "We don't fight battles. We solve problems at 50 miles an hour." Webb's platoon had intercepted a column of German armour near Ardennes, 8 Panzer IVs, advancing to reinforce the front. The Hellcats attacked from the flanks, their engines screaming as they dashed from one firing position to another. They fired, repositioned, fired again. The battle lasted 11 minutes. 8 German tanks destroyed. 1 American vehicle disabled not by enemy fire, but by a broken track. The mathematics were merciless. At 55 miles per hour, an M18 could traverse a kilometre in 40 seconds. A Panther's turret took 15 seconds to rotate 60 degrees. By the time a German gunner identified the threat and adjusted aim, the Hellcat was already firing from somewhere else. The engagement times were so short that German intelligence began documenting them with disbelief. Average contact duration, 2 to 4 minutes. Enemy vehicles disappear before return fire can be coordinated. For the Hellcat crews, it was choreography, a mechanical ballet of precision and velocity. The gunner and loader moved like gears. The driver felt terrain through vibration. The commander calculated risk as instinct. If any man hesitated, the system broke. But when it worked, it was unstoppable. Sergeant Thomas Red Morrison, a former stock car mechanic from Georgia, embodied that synthesis of skill and machinery. He treated his M18 like a racing engine, tuning it obsessively, listening to its rhythm. He once told a journalist after the war, "If I could hear it breathe, I knew it was alive." In Morrison's crew, the assistant driver mapped terrain and escape routes. The loader rearmed the gun in under 10 seconds. Even as the vehicle bounced across uneven ground, the gunner could adjust for range and wind by instinct. The Hellcat demanded perfection, but it repaid it with survival. The battlefield as factory floor. By the autumn of 1944, the Hellcat was transforming the battlefield into something unrecognizable. Where German commanders thought in terms of territory, American tank destroyer units thought in terms of timing. They didn't capture ground, they processed it. A Hellcat platoon would locate enemy armor, calculate terrain, and stage ambush positions. They'd fire from the flanks or rear, always at ranges between 800 and 1,200 meters. Then, before the enemy could organize counterfire, they'd vanish, accelerate to the next ridge, and repeat. It was warfare by iteration. If the first strike failed, the second would follow in under a minute. Every movement fed back into the system. Every ambush improved the next. The Germans tried to adapt, but their doctrine couldn't evolve fast enough. Panthers that once ruled the eastern steppes found themselves trapped in forests, towns, and valleys where their armor meant nothing. The Hellcat exploited those limits with almost scientific cruelty. One after-action analysis from German officer Heinrich Weber quantified the horror. Enemy exposure time, 35 to 50 seconds. Our effective return fire, 2 to 3 minutes. In those missing minutes, entire platoons vanished. To German eyes, it looked like sorcery. To the Americans, it was simply efficiency. The system as civilization. The Hellcat wasn't just a weapon, it was civilization in motion. It proved that organization itself was the ultimate force multiplier. Factories in Flint built it, trains in New York carried it, ships in Liverpool unloaded it. Every bolt was part of a chain of thought that began not with a general, but with an engineer. Germany had worshipped the genius of individuals, the Rommel, the Guderian, the von Braun. America built a system that needed none of them. The Hellcat didn't require a hero. It required a functioning supply line. It didn't need a prodigy. It needed process. It didn't depend on faith. It depended on fuel. That was the quiet revolution. The German tankers never saw a war fought not by men commanding machines, but by machines commanding men. By the time Oberleutnant Klaus Richter's division encountered the Hellcat, the outcome was already sealed. They weren't fighting an army. They were fighting a production model of civilization. The Panther still looked magnificent in the morning, light, sleek, brutal, immovable. But in the distance, beneath the rising smoke, a faint mechanical whine was approaching. Not thunder, not glory. Just the sound of a system that had learned how to kill faster than men could think. And when the Hellcat appeared light, fast, and almost invisible, it wasn't just another tank entering the war. It was the sound of industry itself taking aim. By October 1944, the myth of German armoured superiority was dying not in speeches, but in silence. The silence that followed every ambush. The silence of burning engines cooling in the rain. The silence between 2 minutes and 3. For the first time since 1939, the Panzerwaffe was on the defensive in every sense of the word. Reports from Lorraine, Metz, and Lunéville painted a pattern that no one wanted to read. Engagements lasting less than 4 minutes. Hellcats striking, vanishing, and leaving wreckage where tactics had once lived. In the command dugout of the 11th Panzer Division, intelligence officer Heinrich Weber studied the data with growing disbelief. The numbers made no sense within the old equations. In September alone, 300 German tanks lost 130 to M18 battalions, numbering fewer than 200 vehicles. The kill ratio, 8-1. To an army that measured its identity in precision, these numbers were not statistics. They were sacrilege. Weber wrote in his report, "The Americans are not winning through armor or firepower. They are winning through time. They are removing the interval between action and consequence." He wasn't wrong. What he was seeing was the death of traditional warfare, the replacement of maneuver with velocity. German training had been built for the plains of the East. Long-range engagements, 1,500 meters or more. Clear horizons. Deliberate movements. Armor as fortress, gunnery as art. But in France, the terrain was different. Forests, villages, ridgelines. Distances shrank, and so did the meaning of armor. At 300 meters, a Hellcat didn't need to penetrate a Panther's front. It could circle behind and hit its side before the turret even aligned. Weber calculated the reaction chain of a typical encounter. 15 seconds for a commander to identify the threat. 6 seconds to rotate the turret. 8 more to aim and fire. By then, the Hellcat was gone, 2 shots already fired, its engine howling beyond the next hedgerow. It wasn't a battle. It was execution by mathematics, a war that couldn't be fought. In a requisitioned farmhouse near Metz, Oberleutnant Klaus Richter listened as another Panther burned outside. The sky was black with oil smoke. His crew sat in silence, faces lit by the reflection of fire through the cupola. 3 minutes, the loader whispered. That's all we ever get. Richter didn't answer. He was staring at the Hellcat's technical manual, captured from a wreck near Nancy. The specifications were unbelievable. 55 miles per hour, 360 degrees turret rotation in 20 seconds. Printed in perfect English and stamped with a company name that felt alien on the cover. Buick Motor Division, General Motors. He turned the pages slowly, tracing the diagrams with his finger. "This is not war," he said finally. "It's production." At that moment, he understood the truth Weber had written. Germany was still fighting as a nation. America was fighting as a civilization. Every engagement now confirmed the same pattern. In the Vosges Mountains, German armor tried to outmaneuver the Hellcats, only to find that no matter where they turned, the enemy was already waiting. At Saint-Dié, Lieutenant Marcus Webb's platoon executed a textbook trap. 5 Hellcats positioned on a ridge, each with 2 alternate positions and memorized escape routes. They destroyed 17 vehicles in 42 minutes. The Germans never even located their firing positions. One survivor described the experience. They moved like smoke. Every time we aimed, they were gone. You don't fight men like that. You fight ghosts. The psychological impact was devastating. Veteran commanders like Oberst Gustav Hoffmann, who had fought since Poland and survived Kursk, now faced an enemy that refused to obey the logic of combat. He wrote in his after-action report, "The Americans do not engage in combat. They execute. There is no duel, only destruction." He wasn't exaggerating. At Chateau Salines, his battalion managed a rare partial success. 2 Hellcats destroyed before they could reposition. But that minor victory was meaningless. By the next week, 7 more German tanks lay burning. The terrifying part wasn't that the Hellcat was invincible, it was that it made invincibility irrelevant. The system outruns the soldier. By December 1944, winter closed in. The Battle of the Bulge began. German command gathered its last armoured reserves, the 6th Panzer Army, 200 tanks rolling into the Ardennes under snow and smoke. Their goal? To pierce the Allied lines and drive to Antwerp. But the weather that grounded Allied aircraft also concealed something else, a network of Hellcats waiting in the woods. At Street Vith, Captain James Thornton's battalion dug into frozen soil, their engines idling quietly under white camouflage. They couldn't move fast on ice, but even in defense, the system worked. Each platoon was given firing arcs, fallback routes, and pre-mapped alternate positions. When the German columns approached, they met not resistance but sequence. Staff Sergeant Raymond Cooper's crew fired 2 rounds, killed 2 Panthers, and relocated in 38 seconds. The entire engagement unfolded like clockwork. Where traditional anti-tank guns fought to the last, Hellcats fought to the schedule. The Germans tried to respond with artillery, coordination, courage. But none of it mattered. Every countermeasure was too slow for an enemy that measured war in seconds. The contradiction was now complete. The slower, heavier, more armoured force had become tactically blind. The lighter, faster, unarmoured force had become omnipresent. Even the training manuals of the Wehrmacht began to change. Captured documents from early 1945 show new orders. Avoid engagement with enemy tank destroyers if possible. Withdraw when contact is made. For an army that had once defined aggression as virtue, this was the final confession. Blitzkrieg, the doctrine that had shattered Europe, had met something faster than itself. Industrial mobility. The realization, in January 1945, as the Ardennes offensive collapsed, Richter's Panther was the last operational tank in his company. Snow fell heavy on the gun barrel. The radio hissed with static. He could still hear the echoes of engines not close, but everywhere. He knew what was coming before it happened. A flicker of motion. A streak of light. The first shell hit behind them, harmless. The second struck the side armour. The Panther shuddered. Flames poured from the rear vents. Richter climbed out into the cold and turned once more toward the sound. A blur moved between trees, exhaust glowing faintly in the snowlight, the last image of the machine that had undone them all. Then it was gone. Later, as a prisoner of war, he would write in his diary, "We fought like men of iron, but they fought like a factory. And factories do not tire, nor do they fear, nor do they forgive." In those final months, the German tank corps realized the truth their engineers had never admitted. You cannot outshoot an industry. You cannot outrun a system built to move faster than war itself. The Panther had been the weapon of a nation. The Hellcat was the weapon of a civilization. And in 1944, civilization proved faster. The M18 Hellcat did not win because it was stronger. It won because it was faster than thought, a physical embodiment of a new kind of logic that would define the modern world. The Germans had built a war machine around excellence. The Americans built theirs around efficiency. And that difference, subtle, almost invisible at first, separated the two civilizations more profoundly than any ideology. To Germany, industry was the expression of mastery. The craftsman's hand, the engineer's perfection, the harmony between man and mechanism. To America, industry was an ecosystem. It wasn't about the perfection of one machine, it was about the orchestration of many. The United States understood something the Germans didn't, that speed was not a property of vehicles, it was a property of systems. The Hellcat was not a miracle of engineering, it was the visible symptom of an invisible order. Factories synchronized with railways, supply depots aligned with ports, production schedules timed with frontline demand, a vast nervous system of logistics that moved with the precision of a single organism. When a Hellcat fired its gun in France, the vibration echoed in a factory in Michigan. That was the secret weapon of the Allied war effort. Feedback. Information, production, movement, each feeding the other in a continuous loop of improvement. The Germans built machines to last. The Americans built systems to adapt. The result was not simply tactical success. It was an industrial revelation, the recognition that in modern war, survival belongs not to the nation with the thickest armor, but to the civilization that can learn the fastest. The death of the fortress. For centuries, warfare was about fortresses, stone, then steel, then armor. Every civilization tried to build walls thick enough to resist its enemies. But the 20th century replaced walls with velocity. The Hellcat symbolized the end of that ancient instinct. In its open turret and thin armor, it embodied a truth that terrified traditionalists. Protection is not endurance. Protection is movement. Its design philosophy, speed over steel, was heresy to anyone raised on the mythology of the tank. Yet it worked, because it replaced defense through mass with defense through timing. The battlefield was no longer a geography of trenches and strongpoints. It had become a network of flows, fuel, ammunition, data, coordination. The Panther, the Tiger, they were cathedrals of an old belief. The Hellcat was a factory on tracks, and factories, unlike cathedrals, evolve. This was not merely a technical shift, it was civilizational. Where Germany sought the perfect form, America sought the perfect process. Where the German soldier believed in the singular genius of command, the American system believed in distributed competence, 1,000 minds solving problems at once. That philosophy didn't just win battles, it built the modern world. From battlefield to civilization. After 1945, the war's lesson moved quietly from the front lines into factories, economies, and ideologies. The same logic that made the Hellcat lethal made globalization inevitable. Standardization, logistics, throughput. It was no longer about who could conquer territory, but who could synchronize it. Germany had built the greatest tanks. America had built the greatest system. In post-war analysis, U.S. Army doctrine captured this shift in one sentence. War was no longer about courage, but about civilization's capacity to organize. That line became the mantra of the modern industrial age. The tank destroyer's open turret, the assembly line, the convoy network, all fragments of a single philosophy. That power comes not from resistance, but from motion. In this worldview, even imperfection became an advantage. An engine that could be replaced in hours was better than one that never broke. 1,000 Shermans that could arrive next week were more valuable than 100 Panthers that required 6 months of production. The Germans perfected weapons. The Americans perfected replacement. And replacement is immortality, industrially speaking. The Hellcat's story therefore transcends warfare. It is the parable of civilization, learning that adaptability is the new armor. The power to accelerate, reorganize, and replenish has replaced the power to endure. The machine as teacher. When the war ended, many of the engineers who designed the Hellcat returned to civilian life. They built cars, engines, and infrastructure. But their real creation was a pattern, a way of thinking that would later shape the Cold War, the space race, and even the digital revolution. Think faster, build faster, learn faster. From the Hellcat to the microchip, the lineage is clear. Industrial civilization no longer competes through endurance. It competes through iteration. Every new invention carries the same DNA. Less armor, more speed, less mass, more flow. What destroyed the Panther wasn't a single shell. It was the realization that perfection can't keep up with evolution. The Germans believed in mastery of matter. The Americans believed in mastery of motion. And motion won. The philosophy of velocity. The Hellcat proved a principle that now defines our age. That progress is not about building stronger walls, but about reducing the distance between intention and result. From that moment on, the victors of history would not be those who crafted the finest weapons, but those who built the fastest systems. The engine replaced the fortress. The assembly line replaced the cathedral, and civilization as an organism began to move faster than any of its parts could understand. In 1944, it took 3 minutes for a Hellcat to erase a Panther. In those 3 minutes, an entire worldview collapsed. Because in those 180 seconds, the world learned what industrial civilization truly meant. That the future belongs to those who can act before others can even react. That the new armor of mankind is not steel, but synchronization. The war ended, but the sound remained. In the quiet fields of Lorraine, rusted Panthers still sleep under the soil, their armor intact, their purpose extinguished. Somewhere, beneath the same earth, fragments of Hellcat treads rest beside them, lighter, thinner, but still sharp enough to cut the memory of war. What separates them is not steel. It is philosophy, because the Hellcat was never meant to survive the ages, it was meant to pass through them. After the war, many of these machines were melted down, reborn as the skeletons of highways, bridges, and factory beams. Their engines, once tuned for combat, now echoed in tractors and motorcars. The same 9-cylinder radial heartbeat that once stalked Panthers across Europe became the pulse of post-war America. The hum of production, the rhythm of civilization expanding. The Hellcat lived on, not in museums, but in motion itself. It became the ghost in every assembly line, every cargo ship, every aircraft engine that traded armor for acceleration. In 1950, it returned briefly on the mountains of Korea. The old M18s fought again, this time against Soviet-made T-34 seconds. Staff Sergeant Thomas Morrison, once a young Hellcat commander in France, found himself back inside the same open turret by the Nakhtong River. The terrain was different, but the lesson was not. Speed remained the only armor that mattered. He later told a correspondent, "The tank destroyer was never obsolete, only the men who forgot what it meant." When the last Hellcat battalion was deactivated in 1953, the US Army wrote that the tank destroyer concept has fulfilled its purpose. But the idea it represented never died. It simply changed shape from steel and oil into circuitry and code, from physical motion into digital velocity. Today, the descendants of that same philosophy orbit the Earth guided missiles, autonomous drones, algorithms that decide faster than men ever could. The logic is the same. Strike first, vanish, and repeat. The Hellcat was the first whisper of that future. In the museums of Aberdeen and Bovington, a few restored M18s sit in silence. Visitors walk past them, noting their open tops, their thin armor, their fragile frames. They seem almost harmless beside the hulking silhouettes of Tigers and IS-2 seconds. But those who listen closely can still hear it, that faint, residual hum of the industrial age, that echo of 55 miles per hour. It's not the sound of speed. It's the sound of inevitability. The Panther was an artifact of mastery. The Hellcat was a symptom of momentum. And momentum always wins. History remembers the Hellcat not for its power, but for its principle that civilization's strength lies in organization, not ornament. That the true empire of the 20th century was not territorial, but mechanical, and that the machines of war were only mirrors, reflecting the systems that made them. When Klaus Richter's Panther burned in the French snow, he believed he was witnessing the death of a tank. He wasn't. He was witnessing the birth of a system, one that would define the next 100 years. The industrial battlefield didn't end in 1945. It simply moved inward into factories, corporations, and algorithms, places where velocity still rules, and armor is still an illusion. The last line of Richter's wartime journal survives in an archive, faded but legible. They were not defeated by weapons, but by a civilization that understood systems. And in that sentence lies the essence of the industrial front, that every war is a contest of organization, and every machine from the Panther to the Hellcat is just an echo of the civilization that built it. The battlefield is quiet now, but if you stand in those fields at dawn, where the fog moves low and the air tastes of iron, you can still hear it. The hum of the future, moving faster than memory, a whisper of engines accelerating through time. The echo of the machine never dies. It only waits for the next civilization to listen.